This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Welcome, Talk Catholic, the website.com, your host, Tim Kilcoyne. No agendas here, just the straight and narrow, through Mary to Jesus, the Catholic faith proclaimed and preserved. Hope to see you here every week. TalkCatholic.com with Tim Kilcoyne. It is our Saint of the Month Saturday, and I was just on the internet today, actually, as I'm doing the show, and I came across a particular Franciscan priest, and I believe he was in Preston, England, and he came out. It was a busy, bustling business day downtown, and he came out in his garb with another fellow Franciscan and opened up a little suitcase of some sort and took out the monstrance with Jesus in it and held it high, right smack in the middle of all the comings and goings of customers and business and legal professionals, construction workers, students, the whole gang. And he held Jesus up for quite some time. I think it might have been 15 minutes, while his fellow Franciscan was explaining exactly who Jesus was in the Blessed Sacrament. And ever so gradually, one by one, people started hitting their knees, and he had a huge gathering. And I'm thinking today's saint, Pope St. Gregory the Great, or the First, would have been so proud, because this is exactly what Pope Gregory did to try to put an end to the bubonic plague and holding the monstrance high above the Tiber River in Rome. So the answers are really very simple, ladies and gentlemen. In this time of turmoil in every sphere, it seems, but particularly political and religious, we hear all kinds of controversies and bitterness and divisiveness over the mask and vaccines. But we don't hear too much about what can offset all of this, all of the evil upon us, that being our Lord and his real presence in the Blessed Sacrament, front and center, not just before Catholic, before everyone. The creator of your soul is who we all must turn to, as not only in times of crisis, but in times of good tidings. But no doubt, we need to turn to him right now, and I am amazed, and I sent out a blast email to several clergy and let them know that I waited a lifetime to see something like this in the modern era, a modern Franciscan going right into the heart of it all and putting Jesus front and center before them. How dare he? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly how Christianity spread from the very beginning. And I guarantee you, St. Paul and St. Francis and St. Clare and so many other of the great saints, and that's why we call them saints, would have been so proud of this particular Franciscan. So with that as a little backdrop, I should say, on the feast of Pope St. Gregory the Great, September 3rd, I was watching Mass, and Father Jonathan Meyer was explaining that, who I had interviewed a while back, that Pope St. Gregory did not want to be the Pope. By no means. He was a monk and wanted to live the quiet, regimented life of prayer and study. And it goes to show you, ladies and gentlemen, so often our parents out there, you're beginning the new school year and you're asking your sons and daughters what is it that they want to do with their life. And it's really not that simple. It's not simply a matter of what they would like to do with their life. I know this runs contrary to the American ethos, but it really is the question, what is it that God wants them to do with their life? And the two questions are not synonymous, particularly if it's regarding a vocation as opposed to a simple career option. Often we go about deciding our life's work based on our interests, our passion, and what we're good at, what God has given us to do by way of his giftedness. But sometimes, especially regarding vocations, it requires a going against the grain of those things, not pursuing some of these avenues where you could have been very successful in a secular sort of way relative to that age-old term success, but rather you put it on the shelf and you decide to choose a very different road, less traveled. And this is highlighted in the movie, the old movie, Field of Dreams, for instance, where the baseball player called Doc Graham made the comment later on in the movie that it wasn't a tragedy that he didn't get a base hit when he had his chance for the major leagues. It was a tragedy if he had not had the option of becoming a doctor for the local community. This is how God works so often in a real mysterious sort of way. It's precisely why you have to stay strong in sanctifying grace in order to hear his still small voice amidst all the other voices that are tugging on you, like those closest to you that you love. And certainly some of our college students, they might be freshmen right now going off to college for the first time. They've got to decide on a major. I say, listen carefully as to what God would like you to do, truly, even if it requires going against some of those passions that you might have. And Pope St. Gregory the Great, he had barbarian invasions coming at him from all angles, for that matter, and he accepted the position of Pope at a dire time. There was a plague, a pandemic, just like what we've been experiencing, only much worse. And there was just a desperate need for real ecclesial leadership, and he answered the call. So let's keep that in mind as we now begin to listen to the chronology of Pope St. Gregory the Great. Pope St. Gregory I, also known as the Great, was the Pope of the Catholic Church between 590 and 604 AD. Gregory was born around 540 in Rome. The exact date of his birth is unknown. Although the Western Roman Empire had collapsed long before his birth, many ancient Roman families still commanded great wealth and influence in the city. Gregory was born into one such family. His great-great-grandfather was Pope Felix III, who reigned from 483 to 492. His father was named Gordianus, and he was a senator and a prefect of Rome. Gordianus also held a position in the church with the title of Regionaris, but there are no records from the time which describe the post. Gregory's mother was Sylvia, also from a noble family. Sylvia's sister, Gregory's aunt, Pateria, are both recognized as saints in the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Gregory had a brother, but nothing is recorded, neither his name or his fate. Gregory's family was very wealthy and owned estates on the island of Sicily, which provided income. When Gregory was just 2 years old in 542, the plague of Justinian swept through the region. This was a pestilence later became known as the Black Death. About a third of the population in Italy was wiped out by the disease in the 14th century. In addition to disease, the barbarian Ostrogoths sacked Rome in 546. The Franks attempted an invasion in 554. Both of these incursions were short-lived. It is unclear how these massive events impacted Gregory's development as a child, but it is thought his family retreated to Sicily during part of that time. Peace followed in Italy after these upheavals. Gregory was well educated and excelled in all his studies. He also became an expert in law. He excelled so much he became the prefect of Rome, just as his father had been. Gregory was only 33 years old. After Gregory's father had died, Gregory had the family villa in Rome converted into a monastery. Today, the monastery still stands as the San Gregorio Magno al Celio. Pope Pelagius II, who reigned from 579 to 590, chose Gregory to serve as an ambassador to the imperial court in Constantinople. The Pope had a problem with the Lombards invading from the west. Gregory was ordered to request military aid from the emperor, but the emperor felt there were greater threats to the east and he refused Gregory's request. In 590, Pope Pelagius died, and Gregory was proclaimed pope by acclamation. This was not something Gregory wanted, but he accepted the burden nevertheless. Gregory made clear he preferred the monastic life in a series of writings praising it. He also referred to himself as a servant of God. The habit remains in practice to this day, and many clergy refer to themselves as servants. Pope Gregory was famous for the emphasis he put on missionary work. He sent many people out to bring many to Jesus and into the church. Anglo-Saxon Britain was, at that time, still on the frontier of Christendom. It was Pope Gregory who dispatched St. Augustine to Kent in 597, not to be confused with St. Augustine of Hippo. Pope Gregory made many changes to the Mass, some of which remain today. The position of Our Father in the Mass remains where Pope Gregory placed it. He emphasized the aspect of service to the poor for deacons. Pope Gregory may have also established cantus planus, known in English as plain chant. Most today know this style of singing as Gregorian chant. The melodious, monophonic music is known throughout the church and closely associated with medieval monasteries. Gregorian chant gives us the oldest music we still have in original form, some dating to the centuries just after the death of Gregory. Pope Gregory was well known for his alms to the poor, and he gave quite generously of the riches donated to the church by the wealthy people of Rome. Everything from money to land was given to the poor in some fashion. He made clear to his subordinates that their duty was to relieve the distress faced by the poor. He ordered his clergy to go out into the streets and to find and care for the poor in person. Any clergy who were unwilling to go into the streets and help the poor were replaced. Assets of the church were liquidated to provide income for alms. Clergy doing this work were paid 4 times a year and given a gold coin as a sort of bonus. When a famine struck Rome in the 590s, Pope Gregory ordered the church to use its assets to feed the poor. At that time, the church controlled nearly 2,000 square miles of land overseen by the clergy and used to generate income. Because of his great respect for the poor, it was Pope Gregory and the church that became the most respected and obeyed force in Rome and across Italy. From the time of Gregory onwards, the people looked to the church for government rather than the distant and indifferent emperors in Constantinople. Pope Gregory suffered from arthritis in his last years. He died on March 12, 604 AD. He was immediately proclaimed a saint by means of popular acclaim. St. Gregory's relics remain in St. Peter's Basilica to this day. In 1969, the Second Vatican Council moved St. Gregory's feast day from March 12th to September 3rd, so it would not fall during Lent. Both Anglican and Lutheran Christians also venerate Pope St. Gregory. He is the patron saint of musicians, singers, students, and teachers. Now I'd like to take a look at a particular work of Pope St. Gregory the Great, which I actually bought about a year ago. He is known well for the Book of Pastoral Rule, St. Gregory the Great. And this is very much a compendium of spiritual direction for pastors and people in church leadership. And he goes into real detail about specific things that affect us today as much as they did back then. Here's one right here regarding those who do not speak enough and those who speak too much. Pope St. Gregory says, "Those who do not speak enough and those who speak too much are to be advised differently. It should be suggested to those who do not speak enough that while they flee some vices inadvertently, they implicate themselves in other hidden vices that are even more dangerous. For often when they bridle the tongue immoderately, they suffer from a greater adversity in the heart. As a result, thoughts become inflamed in the mind because of their being violently and indiscreetly silenced. For the most part, these persons allow these thoughts to flow all the more because they believe themselves to be unobserved by those who find fault in others. But sometimes the mind is exalted with pride and despises those that it hears speaking. And when it closes the mouth of the body, it does not realize the extent to which it leaves itself open to the vice of pride. For as it suppresses the tongue, it equally elevates the mind. And because it rarely considers its own iniquities, it accuses others all the more frequently in secret." Wow. So watch out for those silent, soft-spoken facades. I've often said they tend to be perhaps the most dangerous in our church. The quiet Trojan horses. They're not always the most holy. Those who don't want you to know their secretive thoughts. And isn't it interesting, there are often those who seem to want to know everyone else's thoughts, but will never reveal their own. So Pope St. Gregory is well aware that the introvert or very soft-spoken, reserved intellect is very often at war with him or herself. They're not into transparency. They're not necessarily a villain, but they're holding everything in. And ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest that this is oh so characteristic of people in addiction, especially alcoholic. They tend sometimes to have very quiet, reserved, compassionate personalities, which stays off the radar screen to allow them to do what they do too well and too often. So beware of those that are inordinately silent and reserved and never seek that kind of total, honest transparency in God's sunshine to let us know exactly who they are. It's usually often a sign of dysfunction. Remember St. Thomas Aquinas' modus operandi, one might say, moderation in all things, including one's temperament. Now, this pastoral advice should be looked at in its proper context, as I'm reminded of the great, fairly recent book by Cardinal Sarah, The Power of Silence, where, by all means, in order to know thyself, one really does need to go into the desert of silence with God to try to discern situations as to how to act, or just to seek God's wisdom himself. So silence is a very good thing as a place to seek out in the spiritual life. But it is, other than those called to a life of silence and the hidden life of contemplation, we usually go to the silent little nooks and crannies of our life to get away, to recreate ourselves, recreation, and to learn what we cannot hear from the noise and distractions all around us. So silence is a good thing, but Pope St. Gregory is basically saying that those who are too silent too often might be a problem. We will continue on after the break. This is WQPH Radio 89.3 FM. Now, on the other hand, those who speak too frequently should be advised that they rigorously observe from what a great height they fall when they slip into excessive wordiness. What a great sentence that is. The meaningless words that are wasted when the censorship of silence is relaxed are like many streams that flow from themselves. The mind is not able to return its thoughts to internal things because by scattering itself through unprofitable speech, it excludes itself from the mystery of internal considerations, and it leaves itself completely exposed to the enemy who lies in wait because it does not surround itself with a barrier of watchfulness. Oh, this man is one great writer. As it is written, as a city that lies open and is not protected by walls, so is a man who cannot refrain from his own spirit from speaking. Because it does not have a wall of silence, the city of the mind is left open to the darts of the foe. And when by words it expels itself, it exposes itself to the adversary. And so the enemy overwhelms the mind with so much less effort because the mind, which is overcome, fights against itself because of its excessive speech. Moreover, those who become a slave to excessive speaking are not able to hold the straight path of righteousness, as it is attested by the prophet who says, "A man full of tongue cannot be well guided upon the earth." And Isaiah says, "The culture of righteousness is silence." This clearly indicates that the high righteousness of the mind is desolate when immoderate speaking is not restrained. As James said, if anyone thinks himself to be religious, even though he does not control his tongue, this man's religion is in vain, for he is deceived in his heart. And again, St. James says, "Let every one be quick to hear, but slow to speak." For this reason, the truth himself admonished us, saying, "For every idle word that humans speak, they will give an account on the day of judgment." So what would Pope St. Gregory the Great say about people that you and I both know that seem to ramble on and on and on and say nothing? I know that you and I know such people, especially in the field of religious education, God forbid, where you find many that are well educated and well versed, and they let you know it, but not always in God's truth. Therefore, what good was it? How about these evangelists, like myself? At what point do we become overbearing and unrelenting? There is always this fine line that we need in the vineyard to discern correctly as to when to admonish, convince, rebuke, encourage with words. Is the person even open to such a pastoral posture? They may not be. So we always have to go to the silence of the Lord first to try to get that proper wisdom in discernment of how precisely to act and help and counsel perhaps someone before us. And this was what this book of St. Gregory was all about, the pastoral rule, because he really had it intended for leaders in the church at that time. But Relative to, as we would say in the old days, they have the gift of the gab, an Irish expression, I believe. Well, what are we to make of them? Not much. They really need to zipper it more often than not. And sometimes you're better off not saying anything anyway, particularly if you don't want to tell the truth. And I refer you to the nuns in the old movie, The Sound of Music. And the nuns just stayed quiet when the Nazis were trying to find the Von Trapp family. That is called a mental reservation, where they simply said nothing. They didn't lie. So you're really pretty safe when you don't say much at all from unwarranted accusation, because you can always leave it up to them to figure out, as opposed to you speaking a constant blue streak, when in fact now you are culpable for the very words that you have to offer. And I read from the Catechism, we've been all about the 8th commandment for quite some time. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And the whole issue of using one's tongue in a rude or mean-spirited way. And this is where such sins as detraction and calumny or slander come in. Just to refer to paragraph 2477 from our Catechism, respect for the reputation of persons forbids every attitude and word likely to cause them unjust injury. He or she becomes guilty of rash judgment, who even tacitly assumes as true, without sufficient foundation, the moral fault of a neighbor. He or she becomes guilty of detraction, who without objectively valid reasons discloses another's faults and failings to persons who did not know them. He or she becomes guilty of calumny, who by remarks contrary to the truth harms the reputation of others and gives occasion for false judgments concerning them. Detraction and calumny destroy the reputation and honor of one's neighbor. Honor is the social witness given to human dignity, and everyone enjoys a natural right to the honor of his name and reputation and to respect. Thus, detraction and calumny offend against the virtues of justice and charity. I now would like to finish up with a few quotes quickly from the website azquotes.com relative to Pope St. Gregory the Great. Without enough time for commentary, I'll reserve my speech in honor of Pope Gregory the Great. He says, the proof of love is in the works. Where love exists, it works great things. But when it ceases to act, it ceases to exist. If the work of God could be comprehended by reason, it would no longer be wonderful, and faith would have no merit if reason provided proof. You don't climb a mountain in leaps and bounds, but by taking it slowly. We make idols of our concepts, but wisdom is born of wonder. You cannot acquire the gift of peace if by your anger you destroy the peace of the Lord. If the intention is unclean, the deed that follows from it will also be evil, even if it seems good. If only we could get Pope Gregory to go to Capitol Hill and ask a lot of probing questions on the vaccine. Ignorance is a dangerous and spiritual poison which all men ought warily to shun. Affliction strengthens the vigor of our soul, whereas happiness weakens it. Very interesting. The greatness of contemplation can be given to no one but those who love. And may we finish with this one for the times. The human mind is prone to pride even when not supported by power. How much more then does it exalt itself when it has that support? And we might end with this one. For the times that we now endure, the more the wicked abound, so much the more we must suffer with them in patience. For on the threshing floor few are the grains carried into the barns, but high are the piles of chaff burned with the fire. Indeed, it is still by the narrow door of truth, Jesus, that we are saved, and we have to do our part to get as many through him as possible. This is WQPH Radio 89.3 FM, trying to do that exactly every week. God bless you. Let your light shine. That is what it's all about here at WQPH Radio 89.3 FM. But we need to hear your story. You want your voice to be his voice. That is making the faith known to others. Please, my number is 877-625-3727. Tim Kilcoyne, TalkCatholic.com. St. Mother Teresa told us, your ministry is your work right where you are. Grab on to this microphone. God bless.